Well, it's good to see everybody. Why don't we go ahead and get started? In case you didn't know already, my name is Carl Skooglund. Welcome to Treasure Hunt, and hope everybody is doing well. And yes, please, thank you for joining us this morning on a holiday weekend and on a beautiful morning, especially here in the DC area. So we're here to explore the teachings of Buddhism's early tradition as they're recorded in what is known as the Pali Canon. The Canon being the collection of Buddhism's earliest texts. They give us, the Pali Canon, the best chance, I think, of understanding what the Buddha and his earliest followers thought and taught about how to lead a human life. And then it's not just we want to understand what they thought, we want to understand how to put those practices into use in our own lives. We've been exploring the Sāmaññaphala Sutta from the long discourses. That text gets translated as the fruits of recluseship or the fruits of the contemplative life. And in this text, we find a variation of how the elements of the path come together to form, or the elements of the practice come together to form a path. One that might sit alongside what we might more typically know of as the Eightfold Path. So this is sort of an additional portrayal. So the context for this teaching is that a new king, remember this is 2,500 years ago, a new king named Ajatasattu has just taken power in this small kingdom, in this kingdom of his. Unfortunately, we find that he did so by killing his father. Now, in the text, Ajatasattu is feeling unsettled by this, he's feeling unsettled by having done this. And in the very beginning, we find him searching, he says, for somebody who can bring peace to his mind. Well, his doctor happens to be on hand and suggests that he talk to the Buddha, who happens to be staying in Mango Grove, which is a park just outside the city of Rajagaha where they're staying. So Ajatasattu goes to Mango Grove, he finds the Buddha, and then asks him about the fruits of his practice. The question is, what good does your practice do you? And this teaching is the Buddha's 13-part answer to that question. What are the fruits? The first step was to go forth, as it says, which involves the intention of setting aside conventional ways of finding satisfaction in life, and also of setting aside the typical ways in which we resolve our difficulties. The key here is that we search inward, rather than rely on the whims of our external environment. Next, we establish a healthy ethical framework, which at its root is based on being conscientious, kind, and sympathetic, as the text points out to us. Third, we do what is known as guard the senses, which means that we become careful about what we make out of the experiences that arise for us by way of the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. Fourth, we compose our minds by maintaining clear comprehension of our physical activities. This is what gets known these days as embodied awareness. Fifth is that we encourage ourselves to be content in our material state. Instead of being hard to please, we become easy to please, easy to satisfy. In the last class, I laid out the section on the 5 hindrances. And then we were also led by a guest teacher, Mary Aubrey, and she walked us through, shared her experience with what are called the four jhanas. Four realms, you might say, of mind and body, ranging from rapturous to equanimous. Mary also pointed out how the jhanas created an environment for deep insight, which was the next facet of this path that the Buddha lays out in this teaching. Now, if you're keeping track, that's the first 8 of the 13 facets, although I'm actually grouping the four jhanas together. What I'd like to do this morning is spend more time on the last 3 facets. I'd like to devote this class to the interplay between the hindrances, the jhanas, and insight. I'd like to start by pointing out a key transition in the text, in this sequence, this version of the path of practice. So the first 5 facets of this path, ending with contentment, they provide fruits in and of themselves. But they also set us up so that we're in a position to free ourselves of the hindrances. Right? And in case you're new to the tradition, the hindrances are, roughly speaking, attraction and revulsion, dullness and restlessness, and doubt. Generally speaking, you could say that these hindrances, they hinder peace, wisdom, and kindness, as I used to teach kids. But more specifically, the hindrances hinder concentration. They hinder composure and stability of mind. So at the bottom of page 16, if you happen to have it handy, of the Bhikkhu Bodhi translation that I sent, it says this: endowed with this noble aggregate of moral discipline, so he's going through the first steps, this noble aggregate of moral discipline, this noble restraint over the sense faculties, this noble mindfulness and clear comprehension, and this noble contentment, he then resorts to a secluded dwelling, a forest, the foot of a tree, a mountain, a glen, a hillside, a cremation ground, a jungle grove, the open air, a heap of straw. After returning from his alms round, following his meal, he sits down, crosses his legs, holds his body erect, and sets up mindfulness before him. So we could say that ethics, restraint of the senses, clear comprehension, and contentment set us up so that when we resort to a secluded dwelling, metaphorically, when we sit down to practice, we're then in a position to let go of the hindrances, to let go of attraction, revulsion, dullness, restlessness, and doubt. And then continuing with the text, here's how the text puts it. Having abandoned covetousness for the world, that's attraction, he dwells with a mind free from covetousness. He purifies his mind from covetousness. Next, having abandoned ill will and hatred, he dwells with a benevolent mind, sympathetic for the welfare of all beings. He purifies his mind from ill will and hatred. Having abandoned dullness and drowsiness, he dwells perceiving light, mindful and clearly comprehending. He purifies his mind from dullness and drowsiness. Fourth, having abandoned restlessness and worry, he dwells at ease within himself with a peaceful mind. He purifies his mind from restlessness and worry. And then finally, having abandoned doubt, he dwells as one who has passed beyond doubt, unperplexed about unwholesome states. He purifies his mind from doubt. So it's not just that we abandon we let go of, and we purify our minds of what what hinders us, we're also building up, beneficial states, right? As we go along, it says, we dwell with a benevolent mind, sympathetic for the welfare of all beings, right? We dwell perceiving light, mindful and clearly comprehending. We dwell at ease within ourselves with a peaceful mind. And finally, we dwell unperplexed about unwholesome states. When I read that last one, it really caused me to pause, to be unperplexed, unconfused about what gives us a hard time. In the next part of the text, with a range of similes, the Buddha compares being bound up with the hindrances to various states of being burdened, you might say. The text says, when a bhikkhu sees these 5 hindrances are unabandoned within himself, he regards that as a debt, a sickness, as a confinement in prison, as slavery, and as walking along a desert road. So 5 similes for each of the 5 hindrances. So these images, they describe being oppressed, burdened, unsafe, at risk. And then the text makes the switch to being relieved of them, you might say. It says, but when he sees that these 5 hindrances have been abandoned within himself, he regards that as freedom from debt, as good health, as release from prison, as freedom from slavery, and as a place of safety. Right? This is a description of a significant shift in our inner environment. And then there's another little sequence in the text. It says, when he sees that these 5 hindrances have been abandoned within himself, gladness arises. It's the gladness of being relieved. When he is gladdened, rapture arises. When his mind is filled with rapture, his body becomes tranquil. Tranquil in body, he experiences happiness. Being happy, his mind becomes concentrated. So this is a description of being relieved of attraction, revulsion, dullness, restlessness, and doubt. It leads to gladness, then to rapture in the body, happiness in the mind, and happiness in the mind allows the mind to become concentrated. This is basically a description of what the tradition calls conditionality. It's not a complete description, but it's conditionality in that we have a particular set of conditions leading to the arising of another set of conditions. Right? One thing leads to another. Now, if you were here with us in June, Aubrey, very gracefully walked us through the section of the teaching on the 4 jhanas, the next facets of the teachings, the 4 stages of concentration. To start, Mary described how, while on retreat, she spontaneously, had a remarkable experience in meditation. At the time, it was a little unsettling because, no one could tell her what it was. Eventually, Mary was directed to a teacher named Lee Brasington, who confirmed for her that what she had experienced was, in fact, what's called the first jhana. Jhana. Long story short, working with Lee, Mary learned to develop the 4 jhanas and eventually went on to master them. And now she teaches this practice with Lee. Mary described the jhanas as different rooms, she said, different rooms within the mind. Okay. And this is important. It may sound like a little bit of a, as she got into it, as we got into it, it may have sounded, a little trippy, a little bizarre. Yet people all over the world, across the centuries, across religious traditions, have experienced them. You know, in one sense, they're remarkable. In another sense, they aren't. Um, the first jhana is a state characterized by physical rapture. This rapture, piti is the Pali term for this. Alongside that is a form of mental joy. The Pali word for that is sukha. And within the first jhana, also, it's important to note that there are some light forms of thinking and evaluating going on. Like, what is this? How did I get here? How do I maintain it? Thinking and evaluation, vitakka and vichara are the Pali words. And in the full manifestation of the first jhana, the rapture is a full-bodied experience, and as she described, it can be quite intense. In the second jhana, the physical rapture subsides, and the mental side of it, the joy, comes into the foreground of experience, right? And all the thinking goes away too. In the third jhana, there was no more rapture, there's only joy, and there's an element of equanimity coming into play. Right, in the fourth jhana, the joy subsides, and there's no more experience of pleasure or pain, and you abide solely in equanimity. The text says that one abides with a pure, bright mind. Now, the word concentration can conjure up for some of us, images of forcing yourself to pay attention to something, right? Whatever it is you're supposed to be paying attention to, and it can come across as a little aggressive, like hammering a nail into a piece of wood. But really, a more helpful image, more helpful approach, I think, is to see concentration as a kind of settling, a kind of collecting, a kind of gathering of something that's been scattered. And rather than straining, the Buddha creates images of various forms of pleasure and contentment, that come along with concentration. And these are the similes that we find in the text. In the first jhana, pleasure saturates the body like water saturates a mound of soap powder. So it's a complete immersion, saturation of water in the soap powder. In the second jhana, rapture and happiness well up within the body like cool water infuses a lake from a spring. And the key part of this simile is that in this instance, the lake is fed entirely from an internal spring, right? Rather than being fed from the outside by rain or inlets from outside of the lake. The implication here, the point is that this happiness is something we experience from within. In the third jhana, the simile is that of lotus flowers, blossoming below the surface of, again, another cool lake. Being that the lotus flowers being entirely infused with the cool lake water, just like happiness suffuses the body. And one thing to point out here is that with the lotuses being entirely submerged in the water, they're not subject to the elements above the surface of the lake, which kind of points again to how equanimity has come into play in the third jhana. You're not impacted by the shifts in the environment above the water. And in the fourth jhana, it's as if you're covered entirely by a white cloth. Now, I have to say that for a long time, I'd actually been a little confused by this simile when I encountered it. But after Mary spoke, I think that the idea is that with the equanimity of the fourth jhana, it's like you're cloaked in the sense of being protected. It's not got the bulkiness of a suit of armor. It's not that kind of protection. It's light and flexible, but it does serve to keep you from being impacted, disturbed by attraction or pleasure, attraction to pleasure and aversion to pain, all right, which is equanimity. And here are some of the other points that Mary made in addition to describing the jhanas themselves. First point is that, we set ourselves up to experience the jhanas, as we abandon the hindrances, secluded from unwholesome states, as the text says. Just prior to the jhanas, though, once we're not hindered by the hindrances, gladness arises. You might remember that part, which Mary said refers to a little bit of a preliminary state of concentration, that later became known as access concentration. We're going to talk more about the hindrances and access concentration later. But just one more thing about the jhanas, and that is that each one involves a form of letting go. A letting go of one thing in order to come into something else that's greater. For example, we let go of the physical rapture of the first jhana to come into the firmer footing in the mental happiness that's characteristic of the second jhana. And then by the fourth jhana, we've let go of pleasure and happiness and come into a balanced, composed state of equanimity. It's also important to think of the jhanas in context. The jhanas are not meant to be, a place to check out of reality. It's important to maintain the sense of the context such that, in the Buddha's path, these states were meant to put the mind in a position to see clearly. And as Mary put it, in a position to see without ego. So, having achieved concentration, the text, having achieved jhana, the text has us transition into insight. And it says, when one's mind is thus concentrated, pure and bright, unblemished, free from defects, malleable, wieldy, steady, and attained to imperturbability, one directs and inclines it to knowledge and vision. So we emerge from the concentrated state, and then we use that profound steadiness of mind in the service of insight, in the service of vipassana. We direct our mind, incline the mind to knowledge and vision. Now, what does that mean? It could mean we direct it to any number of things. We might, for example, pick up one of the themes in the Satipatthana, right? The foundations of mindfulness teaching. We could direct it towards the aspects of the body. We could direct the steadiness towards an exploration of the nature of pleasure and pain, the nature of mind states, the six senses, the five aggregates, on and on, the Four Noble Truths. That's how we might direct our minds after we come into the steadiness. Or, as Mary said, we might explore some life situation, right? Something, mundane, or, even though it's not mundane, it may not be mundane at all, it may be quite challenging. Just we can direct it towards something we'd like to get a little more freedom around, whatever it is. One other helpful thing I think that Mary pointed out is that she put it, getting concentrated like this provides us with a new set point, so that as we emerge from these states, and we engage in these explorations, it's from a different point of view. As the text says, a bright, pure, malleable, steady heart and mind. So to reiterate, jhana isn't just a place to hang out. That being said, it does offer a form of what the texts call spiritual sustenance, spiritual food. In one of the texts, jhana is compared to spiritual food. It's what we rely on to feed ourselves. It's said elsewhere in the suttas that jhana helps relieve us of the burden of trying to satisfy ourselves with mundane pleasure. Pleasure that runs out and pleasure that's fickle. Because with jhana, we've got something better. We've got something that we can make within ourselves, and not rely on the outside world, not rely on what the outside world decides to give us. In one text in particular, Majjhima Nikaya 139, the Buddha says that jhana is the kind of pleasure that should be pursued. So that might be surprising to some of us. That the Buddha would have us pursue pleasure. Well, this is a helpful kind of pleasure that helps us along the path. Now, one thing that became apparent during the last class is that, as Mary described the jhanas, her own experience of the jhanas, what became apparent is that some of us have experienced them too. Some of us who were there. But we may not have known, what was happening. Well, now, thanks to Mary, we do. All right. Now, this can be incredibly validating, to have your own experience confirmed by the teachings. Have your present day experience confirmed by something that's 2,500 years old. The tradition refers to this as confirmed faith, which is, not a matter of, faith being hope or belief. Instead, it's a form of trust, and that trust comes out of direct experience. And again, if we have access to the jhanas, we now know what to do next. We use them for the sake of wisdom. So all that being said, I'd like to acknowledge plainly that this kind of teaching, the whole concept of getting into these altered states, is likely to land very differently with different people. If you're new to the tradition, the jhanas might come across as, bizarre and a little trippy, or again, that we might perceive them to be a slightly irresponsible form of checking out of reality. Or, it could be that we think, wow, I've been a sincere practitioner for years and I've never even come close to anything like that. Right? So we may wonder what's wrong with our practice. Part of our mind, may think that we're inferior, that we're second class. But just to say, by the way, that, feeling that you're inferior is a form of conceit in Buddhism. So just be careful about that, and any form of comparing yourself to others is a form of conceit. And yet it may come up for us. But just that kind of thing is helpful to just note clearly for ourselves. With all this in mind, I think it would help a lot to remember this section again of the teaching that says, when one's mind is thus concentrated, pure and bright, malleable, wieldy, steady, attained to imperturbability, one directs and inclines it to knowledge and vision. You know, jhana may seem like a big deal, a far off possibility, something way off in the horizon. So if it's a framework that you don't find helpful right now, just set it aside. Set it aside, because the real key is simply steadiness. I also like to use the word composed, as you may have picked up on. So the idea is to be steady and composed so that our eyes have a chance to see. Because in order to gain insight, we need some measure of stability in the mind. That part is clear from the teaching. But in order to create stability, in order to free our minds of the hindrances, we need some measure of insight, some measure of understanding. This is one of my favorite famous verses from the Dhammapada. It is verse 372. It says, "There is no concentration without wisdom, and there is no wisdom without concentration. When one has both wisdom and concentration, one is close to freedom." This is so important, I think, this feedback loop that the verse describes. Wisdom and insight, they feed concentration, and then concentration feeds wisdom. Concentration feeds insight. It's like, you're walking down the sidewalk. You don't hop on just one leg. At least I hope you don't hop on one leg. Instead, you take a step with your left foot, and then you take a step with your right foot. All right, shifting your weight back and forth, maintaining your balance. And the idea here is that insight and concentration support each other, every step of the way. It's not that you try to perfect one and then do the other. Okay. I'd like to spend a little time now on this idea of access concentration, which is another way of framing the portrayal of gladness that comes from being relieved of the hindrances. Mary mentioned this offhandedly, but I think it's worth emphasizing. She said that, even if you don't get into jhana, access concentration is still a valuable position to be in, to act as a jumping off point for exploration and insight. As Mary said, once we abandon the hindrances, we come into what the text called gladness, again, access concentration. And once we reach access concentration, this thing that happens just prior to jhana, we get into access concentration and then we wait. She described it as the room outside of the room, which is the first jhana. So access concentration is a room, and then jhana is another room. And once there, we don't know how long it will take for the mind to shift into jhana. I've come to think of it as, walking in off of a street, and now you're sitting in the lobby of a doctor's office. You've got an appointment. The street being the cacophony of the hindrances, but now you're in the lobby. It's a quiet little space, and the doctor is back there, but who knows when someone's going to walk up to you and say the doctor will see you now. The point here is that it's a situation in which it helps to be a little patient. So in the interest of full disclosure, I want to say that I haven't experienced jhana yet. However, with Mary's instructions, I feel like I have the tools to experiment a little further. I have, however, become familiar with access concentration. which I would describe in this way. And that is that, the mind before access concentration, it's a little like swimming in waves, that are breaking right at the edge of the beach. Right? Coming into access concentration is like getting beyond where the waves are breaking. And instead the waves are simply rising and falling. You're able to simply ride the gentle upward and downward motion of the water. Before that, when the waves are breaking on top of you, it's easy to have them, come down on top, of you, and you get pounded, by them and submerged, in the water. But when you swim beyond the breaking waves, it's easier to keep your head above the water and you can breathe a little more easily. Right? And the thing is that there is a noticeable shift in the two experiences. You still want to stay alert and you have to swim to stay afloat, but the effort is much more relaxed. It feels like a much safer place to be. Now, in access concentration, you're not being pounded, by attraction or irritation, and you're not submerged in your thinking mind. Okay, thoughts may happen, but you're not caught by them. I think this is key, not being identified with your thinking. Now, for those of you who don't swim at the beach, I'm sorry if this metaphor means nothing to you, but I think it's just so apt. Other metaphors for coming into access concentration might be how you sense a difference. You sense a real change, for example, walking off a busy street and going into a library, or a museum or an empty church, someplace that's quiet. These metaphors, I hope, point to, a discernible change in your inner environment. They point, I hope, to a sense of relief or some kind of relief. In order to settle into access concentration, we need to learn to negotiate the hindrances. And, just to say the hindrances may seem like just another one of those Buddhist lists to try to keep in your head. Your minds may perceive them as a kind of homework assignment, that you just don't have the energy for, or maybe the interest in. But over the course of my own practice, I've come to see them, work with them as really being the fundamental portrayal of our emotional life. At least the hard parts of our emotional life, the parts that give us a hard time, that's what the hindrances are. First we get attracted, we get drawn in, our hearts feel all kinds of longing. On the other hand, we get repulsed, irritated, disgusted, angry, or we experience grief, or fear. With the third hindrance, our energy ebbs, we sink and kind of go blank. And with the fourth hindrance, we feel skittish and distracted, we have an excess of energy. We get restless and worried. And then finally, the fifth hindrance is doubt. We feel confused, perplexed. We lose our bearings. Sometimes in our emotional life, we might get overwhelmed by these things. We may go underwater, or maybe they're more of a low grade but chronic experience for us. Or maybe we just try to shut them out. Pretend that they're not there, distract ourselves. So at this point, I'm going to impose another beach analogy on you. But again, I hope it's useful by the end. this analogy came to me after sitting on the beach one time. It was Rehoboth or Bethany, I think. And what happened was that I happened to see, observe, a father and his little son set up in a place about, 10 or 15 feet away from us. Now, the son was about 2 or 3 years old. And when the father set him down, he immediately took off for the waves. And his father, as far as I could tell, wasn't paying attention. Well, the son runs into the surf, gets smacked by waves, and he goes under. And, his father just is continuing to set up. And I'm like, geez, dude, watch your kid. And I was just about to get up from my seat when the father turns around and he casually walks down to where the waves are breaking. And his son is getting hammered. And this guy is in no hurry walking down there. And, and I'm honestly going like, what the heck? Well, the father finally picks up his son, from out of the waves, and the little kid is coughing and screaming and crying. He's really upset. Well, the father carries the boy back to their place on the beach, and sets him on a towel. Now, me from a distance, I'm going, that was a little weird. But I'll tell you one thing. That father did not have to worry about his father, or that father did not have to worry about that kid running into the waves anymore. And for the rest of their time there, he didn't, have to scream at his son, be careful, stay out of the waves. So that is part one of the story. Part two is that after about an hour or so, the father picks up his son, who was playing, in the sand with his bucket and shovel or whatever, and he carries his son back down to the waves. Well, the kid starts pitching a fit. He's screaming and crying and, again, getting really upset. What the father does this time is to hold his son above the waves so that the water just splashes up on his legs. The son is still crying and squirming, but after a couple of minutes, he starts to calm down. And then the father let go of the child and let him stand on his own. And the water would rush in. The father would pick up the child a little bit and then set him back down. Now, eventually, the child was, running around at the water's edge, running around on his own, but watching the waves, running into them a little bit, but backing away when they were big. And the father, he was able to go back to his chair and relax the rest of the afternoon and watch his son play, and not scream at him to be careful and not try to coax him back into the waves. I have no, thinking back on it, I have no idea how intentional the father's lesson was. It didn't appear to me that the father had calculated this whole thing. But in the end, the lesson was, of course, not to be careless, not to dive headlong into the waves and get hurt by them, but also not to avoid them. And more generally, once we learn to swim, we can actually learn to dive into the waves, play in them, negotiate them, and not get hurt. This is part of the fun of going to the beach, right? And, to take the analogy back to the practice, here's the ironic thing about the hindrances. It can actually be fun to learn how to negotiate them, to not be scared by them, or avoid them, but dive into them and not get hurt. Working with the hindrances can be fun, in the same way that learning is fun. And it's not the kind of learning, it's not like memorizing a list. Instead, it's the kind of learning that comes from trial and error, from actual experience. from playing around and experimenting with something, seeing for yourself what works, or particularly what works when, and also seeing what doesn't work. So, how might we experiment with the hindrances? Well, I always like to refer back to the Satipatthana Sutta, which, as you may recall, sets up 5 inquiries for each of the 5 hindrances. So the first inquiry that goes with the hindrances is, we inquire, is a particular hindrance present? The second inquiry is a hindrance not present. Right? We can notice the absence of something that normally bothers us. So these initial steps are almost like doing a little stretching before exercise. We check in, with our own mind. We take note of what's going on in a particular moment, in a particular practice session. We check the water before we dive in, you might say. The third inquiry is that we try to understand how a particular hindrance has come about. Okay, you've noticed that it's there. Well, how did it get there? Or more accurately, how did I make it? The fourth inquiry is how to let go of a hindrance that has arisen. And fifth and finally, how can a hindrance that might typically give us a hard time, how can it be kept at bay? And this is so important, I think, and this is how I'll conclude the talk portion of our time together. This kind of exploration of the hindrances, it is an insight practice. Seeing things as they are and seeing how they come about and how they're abandoned. Right? There's also an element of right effort here because, we're actively trying to relieve ourselves of what harms us. We actively let go of our burdens. In order to explore the hindrances, we do need some measure of stillness. It doesn't have to be the radical stillness of jhana or even the stillness of access concentration. Just some measure of stillness so that we can see what's happening. But, what happens is that in playing around in the mental waves that are the hindrances, we may find that we might find, or maybe we have found, that we are able to swim beyond them. And come into, a remarkable, discernible difference, a discernible stillness, of that simple yet profound gladness that the text describes. And that is a real fruit of this contemplative life. Right? To go back to how the teaching portrays these steps. Each one is a fruit. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention. I hope this has been helpful. And we now have a good amount of time for questions and sharing.
I can ask a question. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. This is my first class in this old school Buddhist tradition. I have come from the Vajrayana path and I'm trying to learn something that's not Lama or Guru led. So these are typically not teachings that at least in my experience, I've gotten from like the Tantrayana school. So for me, it was very different. I took a lot of notes.
Yeah.
I really appreciate this. I honestly feel now that it was sort of like I bypassed so much of this really important core foundational like bricklaying of Buddhism, and maybe went a little bit into other things. So with just kind of grappling with this material, it's going to take me a while for sure. My question for you is, you mentioned that you had never experienced the jhanas. And so I don't know much about them except for what we're reading here. And I do recognize some of these states, at least in terms of meditation and practice. So I was wondering if you can kind of explain a little bit more about what you mean that you've never experienced them, and what do people report as the experience of them, not just what's written here, but other practitioners who've had, if they've shared like what their experience is, and how you haven't had that. Just
Sure. Yeah.
If that makes sense.
The interesting thing about, let me back up a little bit and just say that one of the interesting things about jhanas is that people hesitated to teach them for a long time, because by some versions they were not possible anymore. They were not even possible anymore. That was one line of thinking. But I think more recently, they've started to make a bit of a comeback, simply maybe for no other reason is that people were actually falling into them, and there wasn't a good way to describe them. What I would recommend is go back and listen to the last talk, in which the early June talk, Mary describes them in a little bit more detail, the actual felt experience of them. And just to say too, that as Mary was describing that, several among us who were in that class just, said, "Oh, yes, that's what's happened to me as well." So there are certain ways of terming, sort of the gradation of each of the experiences. I think that going from access concentration to jhana, it's kind of one of degree. Going from a normal mindset into access concentration, it's a real different felt sense, and then it's yet another really different felt sense to come into the first jhana, which some people who are here may be able to describe, but it's a very physical experience, and it actually comes in a lot of different flavors. There's not just one kind. It may manifest in a number of different ways. One thing that Mary did is recommend getting Lee Brasington's book, which I did since the last class. It's called Right Concentration. If you're interested. That book, by the way, cites this text quite a bit. Yeah, thank you, Joe. I don't know if you have gallery view on, you can see Joe held up the book. But Anya, I want to thank you for pointing out that you're coming from a different tradition and that this is a new experience for you. I think it helps to point out how Buddhism is not just one thing, that, over its 2,500 years, there are a lot of different courses, a lot of different directions that the tradition has taken people, I'm glad to offer, glad to share what I've picked up from the very earliest portions of it. I hope that helps.
Oh, sorry, just really quickly. I think that we just in the other path just overrode all of the sort of like mental discussion around Buddhism and went right into practice. So I'm really grateful for this, because it's helpful for the container of like higher meditative states to understand like what I'm actually doing.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's not an uncommon thing now for us Westerners, or in particular, I think, to want to bypass all the study part of it and just go right into practice. But it does help to have a conceptual framework. Not that we can be over reliant and intellectualize that framework, which I think what gives people a little pause and concern. But to go in without any framework can be a little disorienting.
I'd like to mention that since the last class, I've listened to Lee Brasington on dharmaseed.org, and there's some really good talks that follow up on this, including some from a retreat on the jhanas, where he goes into some depth about it.
Great.
So, of course, Dharma Seed is a great resource for general background information on all the Dharma talks there.
Thank you for pointing that out, Ralph. Misha, I think you might have had your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Carl. Thank you for the talk today and all the talks. And I'm hoping you all can see me. The Zoom interface that's happening for me, all I see is black. Right. So I'll frame my question in that the whole point of all and everything is, to have more of the kind or quality of life experience that I want. So I'm very much about efficacious ways, which means how I define that word. So it works.
So quickly, Misha, you may want to turn off your video because your audio is getting a bit broken up.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I did get Lee's book on Mary's recommendation, so I can study about the jhanas as I'm preparing to experiment and hopefully then eventually get some training in that. Meanwhile, in relation to the another aspect of this particular sequence is about ethical practice. Mm-hmm. So what I am endeavoring to do is to sufficiently understand the Buddhist recommendations. I've done some studying of the Eightfold Path, and now I'm working with this sutta that's part of this sequence of teachings, which I really like, by the way. But, translating games that I don't even know what they are to, okay, well, what's the meaning? What is it they're pointing to? So that I can construct an ethical framework that I can apply to my specific life. Mm-hmm. So in other words, I'm wondering if there's something you might point me toward that's like I don't know if it would be a commentary or what it would be. And I don't have to figure out the whole kit and caboodle, top down, this is your first level practice, this is your second level practice. But, if I can do a general framework, then it would be like, oh, okay, my next step as far as wise speech would be such and such, or where I see the most difficulty, therefore opportunity for growth might be in aligning, this kind of action with that part of my life purpose or something like that. Do you have a sense of what I'm asking toward?
Yes, I think so. Our particular teaching that we're in right now, as was pointed out, gets a bit technical in terms of the I guess Bhikkhu Bodhi referred to it as the ethical or the moral discipline, the patimokkha. And just to say, a lot of that came right out of the Patimokkha that the monks, the monastics use. So it's highly technical, and that's kind of why I just in terms of something to work with, pointed back to that one section of the beginning of the section on moral discipline that said conscientious, kind, and sympathetic. And I think if we kind of focus our intentionality on that, use that as something to carry around with us, then a lot of the other ethical actions kind of follow in the wake of that set of intentions. Now, in terms of doing a deeper dive, I think there's a lot of material out there on that sort of middle section of the Eightfold Path, right speech, right action, and right livelihood. But I just think it helps so much to focus on the underlying intention behind behind that section. When we're speaking, be conscientious, have kindness in the back of your mind, I want to be helpful, and being sympathetic, you're picking up on what's true for the other person, or other people, just sort of walk around with that. In terms of mindfulness, that's a form of mindfulness. It's not just to be aware of whatever happens to be happening, it's to keep something in mind. That can be, I think, a very fruitful form of practice, which, by the way, leads to the abandoning of the hindrances, helps us be relieved of the hindrances. I don't know if that helps, Misha, but that's what comes to mind in the moment.
Yes, thank you. That does help. And starting from the trailheads of conscientious, kind, and sympathetic, is like the knot where the net comes together. So that's very helpful. And then a related thing
just to interrupt
is
real quick. That think of it. You use the term trailhead, so I'm going to say those three act as our compass. The trail may end up, the trail could get complicated once you dive in, but if we keep looking at our compass, knowing what direction we want to end up, maybe that's a helpful way to kind of conceptualize it. But go ahead.
No, thank you. Yes, I think that's a better metaphor for it, is the compass, because the detail comes in the trail, and that's in the sutta where it goes into the specific details of how to implement these elements using the compass as one is navigating one's life path. Great. So a related question is that I continue over time studying this wonderful little text, the 37 Practices of a Bodhisattva's Way of Life. And I keep running into difficulty with dealing with the English translation. In many ways seems opaque to me. And every now and then I'll ask a teacher about a passage and say, is this what this means? And they're like, oh, no, you're completely off base. It's this entirely other thing. So I'm wondering, I did a brief search yesterday and came up with a bunch of different books and stuff about, explanations, commentaries, and so forth. Is there anyone that you personally might recommend to help? I want to create my own version that works for me and my languaging of this, but I need to understand it better first. Do you have a resource that you would recommend or suggest to help me understand what this stuff really means in here, so that then I can make my own little version of the book?
Sorry, which book are we talking about again? I missed that part.
Thank you. Yes. It's basically the 37 Practices of a Bodhisattva's Way of Life.
Wow. I'm going to decline to give you advice about that. I don't know anything about that book, so for better or worse, I can't help you with that.
Okay, thank you. Excellent answer. It's good to know when we don't know. Thank you, Carl.
Yeah.
And thank you for offering these teachings and finding them very valuable.
Good. Very good.
And I'm auditorily bowing now.
Okay. Thank you. Stig, I see your hand is up, but I think, Joe, you had raised your real hand at some point. If I remember correctly, saw correctly?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Carl. Wonderful as always. Just such a blessed part of my life and ours, I think, to have your teachings in these regular intervals to just kind of keep us well nourished with your really wonderful, deeper understanding and wisdom with your many years of studying the suttas. It's just such a blessing. And I've enjoyed thinking this morning about how each of us are so different. We each learn so differently. Mm-hmm. We practice so differently. We have different challenges. We have different kind of breakthroughs. It's just fascinating. You know, you mentioned you haven't yet experienced the jhanas or jhana state or states, and some of us have, but you know, I don't have your depth of wisdom on the suttas by any means. I admire and value yours, and I've just approached everything so differently. And I did mention in the last class that I was so exhilarated to learn that what I had experienced were, you know, the first jhana or two, and Anya, you know, I think the main thing that would describe it for me, that Mary really so beautifully described, was the rapture. I mean, it was an altered consciousness, you know, I would describe it as, and but one that was profoundly moving. And and that's just, you know, just a quick thing about that. But I will say that it doesn't in any way make you feel superior to anybody else. It's just a different kind of experience and a breakthrough that really is transformative in the way that it even though you don't stay in that state, it has already expanded your understanding in your world, and that's just an exciting part of practice. And for me, I think it was resulting from ardent practice, which many of us engage in. And I had done a lot of metta meditation, which is one thing you didn't mention this morning that Mary emphasized, that one avenue into, because metta is a concentration practice, and that can be an avenue into the jhanas, and, well, I should say into access concentration, the foundation for entering the jhanas. And I really think perhaps that was my route in. And having really ardently practiced metta for years. And so just wanted to share that I want to celebrate, you know, the differences and the different and exciting places where each of us may be, and just say what, you know, what a wonderful experience it is being able to share in our Sangha and our community and in our class, what we're up to and what we're experiencing. So thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Stig, hello.
Hi. Yeah, so I just want to comment on a couple of check-ins, Anya's, regarding the issue of different traditions. I would recommend the book One Dharma, Joseph Goldstein. It's a great compilation of the various traditions, and I don't think you can go wrong with there and getting the big picture perspective on that. And then in Misha's question on the way of the Bodhisattva, I would recommend Pema Chodron. Her version of that translation, I think, is excellent. It made it really come alive. I see Emily is holding that up now too. You got the whole Bible library there, Emily, don't you? It's great. So those are some things to explore. I think these are great questions. And I also want to just commend Joe's perspective of how enriching it is in the context of Sangha sharing. You know, we all come from these different backgrounds and conditionings, biologies, cultural differences, and the way that all influences where we're coming from, and it broadens our perspective by having these sessions here, and also with regarding the jhanas, that's something that I've had the good fortune to experience, and it is extremely powerful. Something that Mary did not mention, I don't think she did, if I remember correctly, is that it can also be a form of a tremendous workout in letting go, because the experience of the jhana it gives you an enormous desire to return to that. I think it's impossible not to have some craving for that re-entry if you do have that experience. But the journey with that then becomes another great aspect of the teaching. So I'll just leave it at that for now. But it's a wonderful talk, Carl. And I love the beach story that you had. That was just phenomenal. I thought I was curious, too, of what was going on in that father's mind. I think I could totally relate to your proliferation around what was going on. And I don't know if I would have hesitated as much as you did. But that was a real practice of restraint on your part. And then ultimately it came out well, but the kid could have very easily drowned too, is what I see it as. So I don't know if the father actually was coming from a place of wisdom or just luck, but it was a great Dharma story.
At the risk of being sort of gender stereotypical, I don't think that's a story I would have told about a mother. Yeah. I wanted to thank you, Stig. I wanted to cue off of something that Joe said about what are the different methods for coming into access concentration. It's a piece of the talk I had thought I should go and include, but didn't make it in the final cut. But just to say quickly that mindfulness of in and out breathing is sort of the classic method for coming into these states. But Joe, as you pointed out, Mary also said that metta is a form of, a doorway into these states of composure. Really, in one of the suttas, it says that really any of the four foundations, actually, that can be used as a doorway if you contemplate them in the right way. So, staying within the body, contemplating the nature of pleasure and pain, the mind states, all those things that, if you're familiar with the Satipatthana, can become the bases of concentration. And I know that even just in my own experience, even working with the hindrances, those are mental states, not physical ones. They can get me at least into to access concentration. I've been known to get into access concentration, get really calm simply by focusing on the absence of anxiety, which may sound like a kind of a really weird thing to settle my mind around, but it gives me so much trouble normally. So when I come down to sit and I'm doing that sort of body scan of the mind, I can settle there, and the next thing you know, I'm becoming very still around the absence of something that normally bothers me. Anyway, I throw that out there just to point out the flexibility that there is to experiment. And, given the number of traditions, given the complexity of even just the teachings here, it's the really the only what you can't read a book about, swimming, right? And know how to swim. You just have to get into the water and do it. Anyway, anybody else? Yes, Emily.
Yes, I would just like to express how grateful I was to hear you talk about the definition of concentration as steadiness of mind. That I mean, it's in all of the suttas that you speak about, that to be relaxed, to allow. And I love the quote in the Dhammapada. There's no concentration without wisdom, and no wisdom without concentration. But that idea that you really can't strive for concentration. Striving just gets in the way. So thank you.
So Rich, one of the garden metaphors I created for myself relating to what Emily just said is that, we can work hard within the garden to create the conditions, but we don't create the blossom. The blossom happens after we've created the conditions. We can't strive. We can't pull on the little buds and make the blossom come out, but we can make sure the conditions are there.
That's true, but my opinion is that the things that we do to enhance what we think is enhancing the soil to create better plants and better blossoms is often a hindrance. That the best thing we can do is watch and listen to what the soil needs and leave it alone.
True. Yes, Jill.
Just going with what you said about the leaving it alone, and going back to your story about the child on the beach, I think that something more to that is that the dad did perhaps make a mistake. Perhaps it wasn't intentional, but isn't that a place that we start from is when we make the mistakes, when we're not paying attention? I think some of our deepest lessons come, and it's what we do with it afterwards, when we're not being as intentional, what we then do after. And then the risk. So you were starting to say something about risk, but then you said at the risk of being gender stereotyping. But when you said risk, this was a risk for the dad to let the child keep tumbling. And I also think we need that risk. That is where the deep lessons come.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jill.